Is this some kind of joke? Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut through the morning air at Camp Lejeun's precision rifle range. His glare wasn't directed at his struggling Marines, but at the elderly man standing quietly behind the safety line. Do you even know where you are, old-timer? Harold Hank Morrison, 84 years old and dressed in worn Carhartt work clothes, didn't react to the hostility. He held a long canvas rifle case in weathered hands, his posture relaxed despite the confrontation. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing as they studied the wind flags scattered across the range, each one telling a different story about the invisible currents that had been defeating the young Marines all morning. This is an active firing range for advanced designated marksmen. Rodriguez continued, stepping closer. He was everything the modern Marine Corps represented: lean, confident, and equipped with the latest technology. The ballistic computer strapped to his wrist cost more than most people's cars. Civilian access is strictly prohibited. You need to leave immediately. Hank's gaze drifted from the heat-shimmered terrain to the staff sergeant. His eyes held the kind of depth that comes from seeing too much, weathered by decades of experience that Rodriguez couldn't begin to comprehend. Wind's got 3 layers today, Hank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Your equipment's only reading one of them. Rodriguez let out a harsh laugh. Several of the younger Marines shifted uncomfortably behind their rifle. They'd been struggling with this range all morning, their state-of-the-art Kestrel weather meters giving contradictory readings while their ballistic computers calculated solutions that proved worthless shot after shot. The target, a steel silhouette at 1,800 yards, might as well have been on Mars. 3 layers, huh? Rodriguez scoffed, crossing his arms. Listen, Grandpa, I appreciate the weather folklore, but we're dealing with Coriolis effect, spin drift, and barometric pressure that changes every 10 minutes. It's a bit more complex than licking your finger and holding it up. Hank offered a non-confrontational shrug. That computer can't see the thermal updraft coming off those rocks at 1,200 yards, can't feel the downdraft from that creek bed on the right. The flag at your target is showing you what the wind was doing 5 seconds ago, not what it'll be doing when your bullet gets there. One of the younger Marines, Lance Corporal Williams, lowered his spotting scope. He'd been watching the mirage dance and shift all morning, and what the old man said made disturbing sense. The heat waves were flowing in completely different patterns at different ranges, but he wouldn't dare voice that observation. Not to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Rodriguez's face tightened with wounded pride. This old groundskeeper, he'd seen him tending the landscaping around the barracks, was lecturing him on precision shooting. And I suppose you could do better? He challenged, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gestured at the canvas case in Hank's hands. What have you got there anyway? Your daddy's deer rifle? Slowly, deliberately, Hank began to unzip the canvas case. What emerged wasn't a modern tactical rifle with carbon fiber furniture and an adjustable chassis. It was something from another era entirely. A weapon of wood and steel that spoke of craftsmanship from a bygone time. The walnut stock was dark with age and countless applications of linseed oil, bearing the honest scars and dings that told of a hard, purposeful life. The action was a classic bolt design, and the scope mounted above was simple glass without the complex turrets and illuminated reticles that adorned the rifles on the firing line. It was an M1903A4 Springfield, the sniper rifle that had served American marksmen through 2 world wars and beyond, a genuine relic from the greatest generation. The Marines stared in fascination. Most had only seen such rifles in museums or historical displays. To see one here, in the hands of this unassuming old man, was surreal. Rodriguez let out a disbelieving chuckle. You cannot be serious. That antique probably can't even reach the target, let alone hit it. The throat on that barrel is probably shot out from decades of neglect. He pointed at a particularly deep dent in the rifle's stock. Look at this thing. It belongs in a display case, not on a firing line. The moment Rodriguez's finger touched the worn wood, Hank's world shifted. The blazing heat of the North Carolina range dissolved, replaced by the bone-deep cold of a Korean winter. He was no longer 84, but 19 years old, lying in a hastily scraped fighting position on Hill 2082, his breath forming ice crystals in the Arctic air. The same rifle, then new and proud, rested against the frozen earth. The dent Rodriguez had mocked was fresh, shrapnel from a Chinese mortar that had bracketed his position moments before. Through that same simple scope, he watched enemy soldiers moving through the valley below, preparing to assault his company's position. His sergeant's voice echoed across the decades. Morrison, you see that machine gun nest at 800 yards? That's your job, son. 1 shot, 1 kill, or a lot of good Marines don't go home. The memory ended with the sharp crack of the Springfield, its report echoing off the frozen hill. Back on the modern range, Hank's eyes refocused on Rodriguez. The staff sergeant was still talking, still mocking, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Lance Corporal Williams watched the entire exchange with growing unease. He was a good Marine who respected the chain of command, but he also respected his elders. Something about the staff sergeant's blatant disrespect felt fundamentally wrong. More than that, there was something familiar about the old man. Williams had seen him around the base for years, always quiet, always keeping to himself, but he'd also heard whispers from the older NCOs at the armory. Legends about the groundskeeper who used to be somebody special. "I'm not going to ask again, sir," Rodriguez continued, his voice hardening. "This is a restricted area. You're a civilian creating a safety hazard. Put that weapon down and step away from the firing line." Williams knew he had to act. He couldn't directly confront his staff sergeant, but he could make a call that might prevent a serious mistake. "Staff sergeant," he said, standing up from his shooting position. "My scope's fogging up internally. Think the seals failed in this heat. Request permission to take it to the armory for inspection." Rodriguez, frustrated and distracted, waved a dismissive hand. "Fine, just get it fixed fast. We're not securing this range until somebody hits that target." Williams grabbed his optic and jogged away from the firing line, his heart pounding with purpose. Instead of heading to the repair shop, he ducked behind a line of tactical vehicles and pulled out his phone, scrolling to a number he hoped still worked. The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Armory Master Gunnery Sergeant Thompson speaking." "Master Guns, this is Lance Corporal Williams from Weapons Company. I need to ask you something urgent." "What's the situation, Williams?" "I'm out at range 400 with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's team." Williams lowered his voice, glancing back toward the confrontation. "There's an old gentleman here, the one who helps with grounds maintenance. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is about to have him arrested for trespassing." There was a pause on the other end. "The quiet guy with the slight limp, works around the barracks?" "That's him, Master. But here's the thing. He brought an old sniper rifle with him, a Springfield from World War II, and the staff sergeant called him Harold Morrison." The silence on the other end was sudden and absolute. When Master Gunnery Sergeant Thompson spoke again, his voice was completely different, tight, urgent, and stripped of all casual conversation. "Son, did you say Harold Morrison, at range 400 right now?" "Yes, Master Guns. Listen carefully. Do not, under any circumstances, let Staff Sergeant Rodriguez lay a hand on that man. Do whatever you have to do to keep them separated. I'm making a call that's going to change everything." The line went dead, leaving Williams with the distinct feeling that he had just lit a very short fuse on a very large explosive. 5 miles away, in the command center of the Marine Corps base, Colonel Patricia Hayes was reviewing training schedules when her aide rushed in without knock. "Ma'am, priority call on your secure line from Master Guns Thompson. He says it's a frozen chosen protocol." Colonel Hayes frowned. There was no such protocol in any manual, but Thompson was a 30-year Marine who had served with legends. He didn't engage in dramatic exaggeration. She picked up the phone. "This is Hayes." What she heard in the next 30 seconds changed her expression from mild curiosity to profound shock. Her aide watched her knuckles turn white as she gripped the receiver. "Are you absolutely certain of that name?" she asked. After listening to the response, she slammed the phone down and stood up abruptly. "Get my vehicle, now, and tell the sergeant major to meet me at the front gate." Emergency response to range. Back at the range, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had reached his breaking point. The old man's quiet refusal to be intimidated was more infuriating than any argument would have been. "That's it," Rodriguez declared, his voice rising with frustration. "I'm done with this circus, sir. I am giving you a direct order to vacate this military installation." He stepped closer to Hank, invading his personal space with aggressive body language. "If you refuse, I will place you under apprehension and have the military police escort you to a holding cell for interfering with a training exercise." To emphasize his authority, Rodriguez reached out and placed a firm hand on Hank's shoulder, intending to physically guide him away from the firing line. Hank didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at the younger Marine's hand, then up at his face. The expression in his steel-gray eyes wasn't anger or fear. It was something closer to profound sadness, the weariness of a man who had seen too much disrespect for too many years. That's when the first siren cut through the desert air. It started as a distant wail, growing louder by the second. The sound was so out of place on the remote range that every Marine stopped what he was doing and turned toward the access road. A dust cloud was rising in the distance, growing larger and more ominous by the moment. It wasn't just one vehicle, it was a convoy. 2 black command vehicles and a military police cruiser, their emergency lights flashing as they tore across the desert toward the range at a speed that suggested national emergency. The convoy screeched to a halt just yards from the firing line, doors flying open before the vehicles had fully stopped. The first person out was Colonel Hayes, her uniform immaculate despite the urgent response, her face a mask of controlled fury. Right behind her came Sergeant Major Williams, not the young lance corporal but a man who looked like he had been carved from granite and tempered in the fires of a dozen conflicts. The entire range went dead silent. The Marines who had been watching the confrontation snapped to perfect attention. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez froze, his hand still on Hank's shoulder, a look of utter confusion and dawning horror spreading across his face. Colonel Hayes ignored Rodriguez completely. Her eyes were locked on Hank Morrison with an expression of profound respect mixed with barely controlled anger at what she was witnessing. She strode forward, her boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped directly in front of the elderly man. She looked pointedly at Rodriguez's hand on Hank's shoulder, and her eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. Rodriguez snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned by live electrical wire. Then something happened that would be talked about in Marine Corps barracks for decades. Colonel Hayes, a full colonel in command of one of the Corps' premier training facilities, snapped to the sharpest, most picture-perfect salute any of the Marines had ever witnessed. Her voice carried across the silent range with unmistakable authority and respect. Chief Warrant Officer Morris, sir, I apologize for the inexcusable conduct of my Marines. A collective gasp rippled through the line of young Marines. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked like he had been turned to stone, his jaw slack and face ashen. In less than 30 seconds he had gone from complete command authority to being the target of his colonel's wrath. Sergeant Major Williams approached Rodriguez with the quiet menace of an apex predator. Staff Sergeant, he said in a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout. What in the name of God did you think you were doing? Colonel Hayes held her salute until Hank gave a slow, tired nod of acknowledgement. Only then did she drop her hand and turn to face the stunned group of Marines. Gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying the absolute authority of command, you have been failing this exercise all morning because you believe the technology hanging on your rifles makes you marksmen. You have been humbled by 1,800 yards of air and shifting wind. She gestured toward Hank. And in your frustration, your leader chose to direct his disrespect toward a man whose combat boots he is not worthy to clean. The colonel's voice rose, ensuring every word carried across the range. Allow me to educate you about the man you have been disrespecting. This is Chief Warrant Officer Harold Morrison, United States Marine Corps, retired after 32 years of service. She paused, letting the ranks sink. Chief Warrant Officers were technical experts, the absolute masters of their craft. Mr. Morrison wrote the Marine Corps Manual on Precision Shooting in Adverse Conditions. In Korea, he held the frozen chosen perimeter with a rifle identical to the one your staff sergeant called a museum. In Vietnam, he trained an entire generation of Marine snipers, including several who are now generals. The young Marines stared in awe and growing shame. This wasn't just any old man. This was living Marine Corps history. Chief Morrison holds the record for the longest confirmed kill shot in sub-zero conditions. A shot he made at 1,047 yards in a Korean blizzard with iron sights and ammunition that was freezing as he loaded it. Colonel Hayes turned back to Hank. Chief, would you do us the honor of showing these Marines how precision shooting is actually accomplished? Hank nodded slowly and walked to the vacant firing position. He didn't move with the aggressive efficiency of the younger Marines, but with a deliberate economy of motion that spoke of decades of experience. He settled behind the old Springfield, resting its forestock on his worn canvas shooting bag instead of a modern bipod. He spent several moments just breathing, his experienced eyes reading the entire length of the range like an open book. Your computers are looking for numbers, he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute expertise. You need to look for stories. See that shimmer at 1,000? It's telling you about a thermal current. That grass bending at 1,500 yards? It's showing you a wind eddy your instruments can't measure. He made a few simple adjustments to his scope, confident corrections based on a lifetime of reading conditions that no computer could calculate. Hank settled his weathered cheek against the familiar walnut stock of the Springfield. The rifle had been his constant companion through frozen Korean hills and steaming Vietnamese jungles. Every scratch and dent told a story of survival, of missions accomplished when failure meant death for fellow Marines. He took a deep breath and let half of it out, his body settling into a shooting position perfected through decades of life-or-death situations. The range fell into absolute silence. Even the wind seemed to pause in respect for what was about to happen. The target's not just 1,800 yards away, Hank said quietly, his voice instructional despite the pressure of the moment. The bullet has to travel through 3 different wind zones, pass that thermal updraft at 1,030 yards, and account for the downdraft from that creek bed. His finger found the trigger with the gentle precision of a surgeon. Your ballistic computers calculate what should happen. Experience teaches you what will happen. The crack of the old Springfield was sharp and authoritative, a sound that spoke of wars won and freedom preserved. Every Marine on the line tracked the bullet's flight through their spotting scopes, watching for the impact that would either validate or destroy everything they thought they knew about marksmanship. For nearly 3 seconds there was nothing but the whisper of wind and the distant flutter of range flags. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sweet sound of copper-jacketed lead striking hardened steel. A perfect center hit at 1,000 fir. Sharp, with a rifle older than most of the Marines' grandfathers. The eruption of spontaneous applause and cheers from the young Marines was immediate and heartfelt. It wasn't just appreciation for exceptional shooting. It was recognition of mastery that transcended technology and spoke to something fundamental about the warrior spirit. Colonel Hayes shook her head with admiring disbelief, then turned that expression cold as she faced Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. "Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice dangerously low, "your arrogance blinded you to an opportunity that most Marines would kill for. You had a living legend standing here offering wisdom earned through combat you can't imagine, and you treated him like a trespasser." Rodriguez stood rigid, his face burning with shame. "Ma'am, no excuse, ma'am." "There is no excuse," Colonel Hayes confirmed. "You and your entire team will report for 2 weeks of remedial training in environmental shooting and respect for your elders. Your instructor will be Chief Morrison, if he's gracious enough to accept the assignment." Hank rose from the firing position, his joints protesting quietly after decades of hard use. He walked over to Rodriguez, who couldn't meet his eyes, and placed a gentle hand on the younger Marine's shoulder, the same shoulder Rodriguez had grabbed in anger moments before. "The equipment helps, son," Hank said quietly, his voice completely free of triumph or vindication. "But it doesn't replace what's up here." He tapped his temple with a scarred finger. "The wind doesn't care about your computer, it just is. You have to learn to listen to it, not just measure it." As Hank held the old Springfield, its familiar weight triggered another flood of memories. He was a young lance corporal again, barely 20 years old, standing in the bitter cold of a Korean dawn. Master Gunnery Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, a veteran of Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, was pressing this very rifle into his shaking hands. "She's not fancy, boy," O'Malley had said, his breath firm ice crystals in the sub-zero air. "She's heavy. She'll kick you if you don't hold her right, and she don't forgive mistakes. But she'll never lie to you." The old Marine's eyes had held the weight of 3 wars as he continued. "The wind, the cold, the fear, they'll all lie to you. Your sergeants might lie to you if it means completing the mission. Hell, sometimes even your own eyes will lie to you. But this rifle," he patted the Springfield stock, "she'll tell you the truth every time. You just gotta learn her language." That rifle hadn't just been a tool, it was a sacred trust. A piece of Marine Corps heritage passed from one generation of warriors to the next. O'Malley had carried it through the Pacific, and now it was Hank's responsibility to prove worthy of that legacy. The memory shifted to that first impossible shot. Chinese soldiers moving through a valley 1,200 yards away, preparing to overrun a company of surrounded Marines. No wind meters, no ballistic computers, just iron sights, frozen fingers, and the absolute necessity of success. He had made that shot, and 17 others like it over the next 3 days, holding the perimeter until reinforcements arrived. The rifle had never let him down. Now, 60 years later, watching these young Marines struggle with their advanced technology, Hank understood what Master Gunny O'Malley had been trying to teach him. The tools evolved, but the fundamentals remained constant. Patience, observation, and the wisdom to trust experience over instrumentation. "Chief Morrison," Colonel Hayes said, breaking into his reverie, "would you be willing to formalize your instruction? The Marine Corps could benefit enormously from incorporating your methods into our advanced marksmanship curriculum." Hank considered the request carefully. He had spent decades in quiet retirement, content to tend the base grounds and watch new generations of Marines train for conflicts he hoped they'd never face. But seeing their over-reliance on technology, their disconnect from the fundamental skills that had won wars, stirred something in him. "I reckon I could spare some time," he said finally. "These young Marines deserve to know what their predecessors knew. Technology's a tool, but it's not a substitute for fieldcraft." He looked directly at Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who was still standing at rigid attention. "You're a good Marine, son. You just forgot that the best computer ever built is right here." He tapped his temple again. "Sometimes the old ways still work." Rodriguez managed a weak smile. "Yes, Chief. I'm beginning to understand that." 2 weeks later, the atmosphere at Range 400 had been completely transformed. Instead of frustrated Marines hunched behind high-tech rifles, a different scene played out each morning. A semicircle of elite marksmen, including a deeply humbled Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, sat cross-legged on the desert ground. At the center of the circle sat Hank Morrison, not behind a rifle but holding simple objects: a blade of grass, a handful of dust, even a cigarette paper. "Your Kestrel weather meter cost $15,000, Hank was saying, holding up the blade of grass. "This cost nothing, and it'll tell you more about what the wind's actually doing than any electronic gadget ever built." He released the grass and watched it flutter in the morning breeze. "See how it spins? That means the wind's got vertical components your meter can't measure. See how it changes direction twice before hitting the ground? That's telling you about air currents that'll push your bullet in ways no computer can calculate." Lance Corporal Williams, who had made the crucial phone call, raised his hand tentatively. "Chief, how do you learn to read all these signs?" "Same way you learn to walk, son. Practice, observation, and making mistakes until you don't make them anymore." Hank's weathered face creased into a patient smile. "I've been watching wind for 60 years. Every shot teaches you something new." The Marines were discovering that Hank's methods went far beyond simple marksmanship. He taught them to observe their environment with an intensity that bordered on meditation, to read the landscape like a book written in thermal currents and pressure gradients. "Your generation's used to instant answers," Hank continued. "Push a button, get a solution. But nature don't work that way. Nature's got patience, and she rewards those who have patience too." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had become Hank's most devoted student, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility and hunger to learn. "Chief," he said during one session, "I need to apologize again for how I treated you. I was so focused on my equipment that I couldn't see the expertise standing right in front of me." Hank nodded approvingly. "Equipment's like a crutch, son. Useful when you need it, but it can make you weak if you lean on it too much. The day your battery dies or your computer gets damaged, you better know how to read the wind with your own eyes." The Marines were learning that true marksmanship was as much art as science. Hank taught them to feel barometric pressure changes in their sinuses, to see thermal currents in the way birds flew, to hear wind patterns in the sound grass made when it moved. The Marine Corps brass took note. Officers from Quantico began making regular visits to observe Hank's unconventional methods. What they saw was remarkable. Marines who had been struggling with 600-yard shots were now making consistent hits at 1,000 yards and beyond, using techniques that couldn't be programmed into any computer. "We're not just creating better shooters," Colonel Hayes reported to her superiors. "We're creating Marines who understand their environment in ways that technology can't replicate." 3 months after the confrontation that had changed everything, Hank Morrison found himself in a place he'd never expected to be, standing before a packed auditorium at Marine Corps Base Quantico, addressing an audience of senior officers and master instructors. The invitation had come from the commandant himself, asking Hank to present his methods to the Corps' leadership. At 84, he was finally receiving the recognition that his decades of quiet service had earned. "Gentlemen," Hank began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium, "you've asked me to talk about marksmanship, but what I'm really here to discuss is wisdom." He clicked to his first slide, not a complex ballistic chart or equipment diagram, but a simple photograph of a Korean hillside covered in snow. "This is Hill 28-2. Where I learned that the most sophisticated weapon ever created is the human mind properly trained and patiently applied. Every piece of technology we've developed since then has been an attempt to replicate what a well-trained Marine can do with nothing but experience and observation." The audience listened with rapt attention as Hank described methods that seemed almost mystical but were based on solid understanding of physics and meteorology. He spoke of reading wind patterns in the movement of birds, of feeling barometric pressure changes through subtle shifts in how sound carried, of using natural phenomena that electronic instruments couldn't detect or measure. "The danger," he continued, "is that we're raising a generation of Marines who can operate computers but can't read the natural world. What happens when the satellites go down, when the batteries die, when they're operating in conditions their equipment wasn't designed for?" Colonel Hayes, sitting in the front row, nodded approvingly. Since implementing Hank's methods at her base, first shot hit percentages had improved by 40%. And Marines were successfully engaging targets at ranges previously considered impossible. After the presentation, a young captain approached Hank with a question that struck to the heart of everything he'd been trying to teach. Chief, with all due respect, isn't there a danger in relying too heavily on intuition and experience? Shouldn't we trust technology over human judgment? Hank smiled, recognizing the same mindset that had driven Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's initial hostility. Son, technology should enhance human judgment, not replace it. A computer can tell you what the wind speed is right now, at one specific point. Experience tells you what it's going to be doing 50 yards downrange when your bullet gets there. He paused, looking around the auditorium at faces representing the future of Marine Corps leadership. I'm not here to argue against progress. These new systems are remarkable tools, but tools are only as good as the people using them, and people are only as good as their understanding of the fundamental principles that make the tools work. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. 6 months later, the Morrison method had been officially integrated into the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School curriculum. Hank found himself busier in retirement than he had been in active service, traveling between bases to train instructors who would carry his methods to the next generation. 2 years after the incident that had transformed his retirement, Hank Morrison sat on a park bench near his small house off base, watching his garden grow in the late afternoon sun. Atlas, his old German shepherd, dozed at his feet in the warm Carolina sunshine. At 86, Hank had officially retired from his retirement. The Marine Corps had honored him with ceremonies and commendations that he accepted with characteristic humility. His methods were now taught at every advanced marksmanship school in the military, and his influence had spread to law enforcement agencies across the country. But perhaps his greatest satisfaction came from quieter moments like this one, when young Marines would seek him out for advice that had nothing to do with shooting. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now promoted to gunnery sergeant, was one of his regular visitors. The transformation in the young Marine had been remarkable, from arrogant technician to thoughtful instructor, who understood that leadership meant more than simply following procedure. Chief, Rodriguez said, settling onto the bench beside him, I wanted to thank you again for everything you've taught us, but I also wanted to ask you something personal. Hank nodded, encouraging him to continue. How do you stay so patient with people like me? I was incredibly disrespectful to you, questioning your knowledge, treating you like you were just some old man who didn't understand modern warfare. Hank was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle high overhead, reading the thermal currents with the same skill he'd taught his Marines to observe. Son, he finally said, I was young once, thought I knew everything, believed that the new ways were automatically better than the old ways. Took an old Marine named O'Malley to teach me that wisdom doesn't become obsolete just because the technology changed. He gestured toward his garden, where tomatoes grew in neat rows despite the challenging clay soil. Every generation has to learn the same lessons for themselves. My job isn't to be offended by youth's arrogance, it's to help guide that energy toward wisdom. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. The Marines in my unit now, they approach problems differently. They still use all the modern equipment, but they understand it differently. They see it as part of a larger picture instead of the whole picture. That's the goal, Hank replied. Technology should make us more effective, not more dependent. The Marine who can hit a target at 1,800 yards with a computer is impressive. The Marine who can hit the same target when the computer fails is invaluable. As the sun set over the base, casting long shadows across the peaceful evening, Hank reflected on the unexpected turn his retirement had taken. He'd spent 3 decades in quiet service, content to tend the grounds and watch from the sidelines as new generations of Marines prepared for challenges he hoped they'd never face. Now, through a confrontation he'd never sought and recognition he'd never desired, his knowledge had found new purpose. The old ways hadn't just survived, they'd proven essential for understanding the new one. Sometimes Hank thought the best legacy isn't what you accomplish, but what you help others understand about what's possible.